some version of the following. Well, it really wasn't as bad as they made it out to be. And they just blew it all out of proportion. They overreacted. And besides, I didn't really know what I was doing, and I couldn't really help myself, or, I had had a drink or whatever. Then if you ask those same undergraduates to recount a story of what it was like when they were the victim of something nasty, they all say pretty much the same thing. Like, the person had absolutely no reason to do this, and it was really, really, really horrible. And so we have a point of view. I don't know whether we really want to call it confabulation or not. But when Baustein then went on to interview the really nasty serial killers and so forth, they would say many of the same things. The person sort of had it coming, and besides, I didn't hurt them until, I tried to kill them as easily as possible. I mean, they'd actually say those things. And besides, it sort of happened before I realized what I was doing. We're very strange, we humans. Okay, so I'm going to try to finish up by saying a little bit about moral principles. And the reason I want to put that in here is because, in a way, the whole notion of responsibility and fairness of responsibility, fairness of punishment, and so forth, invites us to think in the broader context about what morality is and where it comes from and how it all makes sense. Okay, so there are basically three ideas about where moral principles come from. One is that they have a religious origin, and they come from divine authority, and then there's different divines, of course. Other people think that they come out of reason, and that humans uniquely have moral principles. And the third one, which is the most biological of the three, and really appealed to David Hume, the Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, he felt that we have what he called a moral sentiment. We are disposed to cooperate and help and to be outraged by certain kinds of behavior. And I just want to say a little bit about each of those, and then, of course, I will take a biological approach. Socrates, and this was a little over 2,000 years ago. Socrates actually had the right answer to people who think that morality comes from religion or comes from a divine source. And we have to kind of, every generation and every philosophy class, we need to remind people that what Socrates' argument was. And I'm sure those of you who've taken philosophy have been exposed to this. So there is Socrates. He's going to be put to death for persuading the youth of Athens to question authority. And a priest who really thinks quite well of himself is on the way to actually imprison his father. And he visits Socrates. And they begin to talk about what's right and what's wrong, and what's moral and what's not. And so Socrates says, well, Euthyphro, scratches his tummy, what makes something right? Euthyphro sort of says, well, don't be such a pompous ass. I mean, of course, it's the gods. And so Socrates asks this question. He says, does God command something because it is right? Or is a command right because God commands it? So Euthyphro says, well, obviously not the second. Because if it were the second, then whatever the gods were to command, like take your firstborn, boil it up, throw it to the dogs, if the gods were to command such a thing, it would be right, according to the second. So, says Euthyphro, well, of course, obviously I didn't mean that. But then says Socrates, if it's the first, then notice that the rightness or wrongness inhering in our behavior comes not from the gods. The gods are, so to speak, at best, a mouthpiece, a communicator. So the result of this, I mean, there's many ways about talking about the relation between morality and religion, but the result of this very simple argument really is that any story you want to tell about the relation between religion and ethics suddenly becomes very complicated. And now you have to do things that most of us find very awkward, like say that you have special knowledge that others can't have, that God wants thus and such to be done, or to be very dogmatic about which amongst the array of so-called sacred books is the right sacred book, and so forth. And it becomes difficult. And essentially, I think Aristotle, following after Plato, was Plato's pupil, realized that you have to give an answer that ultimately is rooted in the nature of what we are, our nature as biological beings. And that was a long time ago for Aristotle to actually realize that. And something that I think he would have understood completely is that we are social creatures. Those are our impulses. Trustworthiness is a value. Building up a reputation as someone who helps, who can be counted on, means that in the long run you do better than otherwise. So social isolation, we talked about this earlier, is a real cost. A lone wolf has a hard time of it. He has to scrounge for mice and gophers. A wolf within the pack can help bring down a caribou, and then there is a feast, and so forth. And I think it's very easy to imagine our ancestors in the ancestral condition, where banding together for mutual defense, food sharing, and so forth was enormously valuable. So there's really two parts to the story of the biology of moral dispositions. And one is that we want models, we want to use the models of how the genetic platform can make social behavior, altruism, cooperation, and so forth possible. And many people have been involved in making those models. William Hamilton, John Maynard Smith, Trivers, and many, many others. And the work is very beautiful. And one of the most recent issues of Science, I think a December issue, has several pieces in it, one by Novak and one by Bowles, that I think are especially important. And then there's the issue of the neurobiology of social behavior. When I first began studying neuroscience, the idea that we might actually understand some parts of social behavior in neurobiological terms just seemed far-fetched. Not in my lifetime. But of course, it is happening. So we all know about the models about what you need in order for altruistic, in that special sense, traits to spread throughout a population. It's important that you need to be able to punish those who would violate the norms. And the models at least show that. And the models suggest that if you don't punish, then things very quickly, over a few generations, are such that the cheaters dominate the altruists. Now, but I really I want to get to a little bit about the neurobiology before we finish up here. Paul MacLean was a neuroscientist who in the 50s really launched the pioneering studies on the limbic system. Gave the limbic system the name, but he was very interested in the fundamental motivations and drives of behavior. And he realized very well that it was not going to come from fancy courses.